Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Science and Humanities Seminar. Today is a very special seminar, and that's why we have also changed the usual time. I see many new faces. Welcome, everybody. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mauricio Diaz-Granados, Chief Science Officer and Dean of Science here at NYBG. And I want to start, we usually start with some highlights. So I'm going to provide some highlights here in the first 5 or 10 minutes. But first I want to begin by extending a warm welcome to representatives from the Consulate General of the Netherlands, Robert Kloos, Deputy Head Press and Cultural Affairs, and some of their distinguished team. Very welcome here to NYBG. This is your home. And unfortunately, cultural attaché Monique Roux sent apologies for not being able to attend. Also, I want to welcome some of my dear colleagues and friends. Tiziana Ulian, Senior Research Leader from Kew Gardens. Many thanks. As well as Colin Curry, Senior Director of Science and Conservation of the San Diego Botanic Gardens, and Ben Naman, Director of Medicinal Plants Research at San Diego Botanical Gardens. Thank you very much. And then I want to start with the highlights. Ken Carroll, thank you very much, Ken. He recently led 3 tours of the lab for undergraduate botany students and instructors from Connecticut College and Dominican University in Rockland County. So you see the pictures of Ken with the students giving the tour. Also, Nicole Tarnowski led 2 tours of the herbarium over the weekend for nearly 40 undergraduate botany students, also from Connecticut College. Thank you very much, Nicole. We have big news. Thank you to a very generous gift from Bethany Millard. We have signed a collaboration agreement with FIU, Florida International University, with the International Center for Tropical Botany, the ICTB, at the Kampong Botanic Gardens, to fund PhD students working at both the ICBT and NYBG. Our graduate studies program now works with 7 universities. So that's big news for us. And thank you, Larry, Fabian, and all the team for materializing this new agreement. Thank you. On Saturday, April 20th, the science team helped NYBG to celebrate Earth Day with educational exhibits from the herbarium, the library, and Meet the Scientists event. Brad Oberly, along with John Wick-Hackey, is that how you say, John? And Larry Kelly were the day's scientists and displayed their work to a continued stream of engaged visitors. So you see the pictures of Brad and John in there. But also Stephen Sinon and Christine Paulus represented the library and gave away a lot of free books to our many bibliophile visitors. So I missed it. And the herbarium represented by Kelsey Brown, Talia Maglione, Elizabeth Gioli, Nicole Tarnowski, and Kenneth Walker attracted interest from a lot of visitors as well. Herbarium staff share a collection of cool herbarium specimens, taught visitors to mount their own specimens, talk about the biocultural information contained in the herbarium specimens, and had also dissecting microscopes for the visitors to interact with and to see plant samples at high magnification. So thank you everybody for participating in these very important events. News from the field. So this is Kate Armstrong, one of our curators. She's conducting field and herbarium work in Vietnam at the moment and meeting with different in-country scientists as part of an exploratory trip to start new floristic and biogeographic projects in the area, as well as establishing new partnerships and collaborations. So that's Kate sending us her pictures, and hopefully I can report to you on the work that Greg Plunkett is doing right now in New Caledonia and Vanuatu. Regarding news from this weekend as well, I basically just came back from Colombia. I spent the weekend over there. I was attending the International Fair of Books in Bogota. This is one of the most important book fairs in Latin America. And I delivered 3 keynote presentations on the role of botanical gardens to address the climate and biodiversity crisis, on the current status and future scenarios of the environment for the Americas and the world, and on my favorite plants and ecosystems, the paramos and the frailejones, and you have heard me talking about those, which are both under threats of climate change and land use change. And that was a wonderful opportunity, actually, to showcase what we do in NYBG, to strengthen high-level collaborations, to inspire broad audiences attending the fair, and to establish new collaborations and opportunities for us. Also, we just finished a very successful 2-day symposium we had on the PTFI, so the Periodic Table of Food Initiative. We had the first day of the symposium here at NYBG on Tuesday, and yesterday we were at the Rockefeller Foundation here at NYBG with this symposium. We had about 250 attendees, and it was absolutely fantastic, astonishing team of attendees and invited speakers talking about all aspects of food plants and research involving communities, involving all the various aspects of our foods. And tomorrow, we will have a very special seminar by Tiziana Ullien. She will talk about unlocking plant resources for a sustainable future from conservation to use. So everybody's welcome to come here tomorrow at 12. And now I'm gonna pass it to Rhonda or to Lucas to introduce today's presentation and speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucas Martakian. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Humanities Institute here at NYBG, which is co-organizing today's event with the New Amsterdam History Center. So welcome to all of you. Welcome to all our guests. Again, as I said, this is co-organized by the Humanities Institute at NYBG. Just the New York Botanical Garden, as you know, is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people, and we honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In a minute, I will also turn it over to Rhonda, director of the library, who will introduce today's program entitled Peaches, Pearls, and Purslane Recreating Dutch Gardens in 17th Century New Amsterdam. And Rhonda will also introduce our wonderful speakers, Eric and Toya. But before I do so, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the Humanities Institute here at NYBG, especially for those of you who are visiting. The Institute is housed at the Lou Esther Timmers Library, where we are now, and it was founded in 2014 to be an institutional platform at NYBG for interdisciplinary research on plants at the intersection of the humanities, the arts, and the sciences. And in a little over a decade, it has already hosted around 70 short and long-term fellows, hailing from very different disciplines, such as history of science, landscape studies, literary studies, and others. All of these fellows have integrated the library's rich collections and even the scientific collections, such as the herbarium, to produce innovative and creative research. And many, many dissertations, peer review articles, books, even groundbreaking monographs such as Victoria Johnson's American Eden, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in 2018 came out of those residencies here at NYBG. So we're extremely proud of the research that has been produced at the Humanities Institute. We have also organized numerous public lectures and symposia around topics such as plant intelligence, humanistic uses of herbaria, landscape design in Brazil, and many others. And since 2022, we have focused our research and community engagement programs in the emerging field of food humanities, which is somewhat related to today's presentation. In the next 2 weeks, you will hear from our current Mellon Fellows who are completing their term here at NYBG. But today we have a very special program that I believe is a true model for the kind of research and collaborations that the Humanities Institute wants to promote. It builds bridges between scientists, humanists, and visual artists and designers, as you will see in a minute. It also involves partnerships across different organizations. It foregrounds both scholarly rigor, but also creativity. And perhaps more importantly, it does all of this to allow us to look at our surrounding environment with refreshed and new eyes. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to Rhonda, who will introduce today's speakers and will tell you more about our very exciting program. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the Lou Esther T. Mertz Library, a premier center for the study of botany, gardening, and horticulture, and their significance to human culture through the ages. We are so glad to see you all gathered here for Peaches, Pears, and Purslane recreating Dutch gardens in 17th century New Amsterdam, a special program co-presented with the New Amsterdam History Center, which focuses on the early history of Manhattan and its diverse cultures. Thank you to Executive Director Esme Berg and Director Michael Kavanaugh and their enthusiastic team. As you may know, the Mertz Library houses an enormous collection of books, manuscripts, treaties, botanical artworks, and more, comprising both modern and historical works published in more than 96 languages, and yes, including Dutch. We invite you to come and dive in for yourself. The Mertz Library is always free and open to the public for all to visit and explore. This morning, together with my wonderful colleagues, I am pleased to offer you a sneak preview of some of our extraordinary works dating back 4 centuries in the early days of Manhattan. A rare selection of herbals, botanical treatises, and garden print books that were published in the Netherlands in the late 16th and 17th centuries. They are examples of the expanding role of the Netherlands as a center for book printing and publishing, stimulated, among other factors, by religious freedom and the influx of artists and artistic skills to Holland. We picked these works because they would have been in the Dutch households in New Amsterdam. Especially indispensable is the herbal, such as Dodoen's Kruidboek, filled with crucial medical botanical information, long before the days of urgent care. In fact, in the more well-to-do New Amsterdam family homes, 2 books would have graced the table, a herbal and the Bible, to ensure both one's physical and spiritual health. In addition to herbals, we have on display very popular garden treatises. In the first half of the 17th century, citizens of New Amsterdam focused on the kitchen garden for necessary sustenance. But later in the century, they added garden plots for aesthetic enjoyment. They would have used illustrations of geometric garden layouts in the print works as models for their own flower gardens planted with tulips, daffodils, and other flowers. A good example of such a printed book, loved by Amsterdammers and New Amsterdammers alike, is Crispin van de Pas's Hortus Floridis, featuring a courtyard garden and many beautifully illustrated bulbous plants. Both Dodoen's and de Pas's works, as well as others by Clusius and Maria Sibelius Marian, also on display here, reflect the starting point of a rapidly expanding worldwide botanical exchange. They define the moment of the first major influx into America of new plant materials, about which you will hear more from our expert speakers this morning. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Toya Dubin helped to launch the New Amsterdam History Center's Mapping Early New York, a detailed encyclopedia of Dutch colonial history linked to maps of the Castello Plan, the earliest map of New Amsterdam. Toya is president of Hudson Archival, responsible for the digitization of the Dutch documents collection at the New York State Archives. She lives in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by Dutch history. Dr. Eric Sanderson is the inaugural Vice President for Botanical Science and Director of the Center for Conservation and Restoration Ecology here at the New York Botanical Garden. He is the author of the best-selling Manhattan, A Natural History of New York City, and 3 other books about biodiversity loss and climate change. He is an optimist, despite his work as a historian, conservation biologist, and urbanist. Eric earned a PhD in ecology and a BAS in English and biochemistry from the University of California, Davis. And now to start our program, I will turn it over to Eric.
Thanks, Rhonda. I forgot how long that bio was. That's crazy. So gardens, we appreciate gardens for what they bring to us, every day when we go out to them, right? That's really about the experience of a garden. But gardens are also cultural artifacts. Like, why do we find them useful? Why do we find them beautiful? Those are functions of the culture that we're living in. But if you actually talk to gardeners or to my botanist colleagues that are here, you'll see that the actual practice of keeping a garden is really about extending your thinking through time. If you want something for next year to flower in the spring, you need to plant it in the fall. You need to understand the soils. You need to understand the land use history. And even, the natural history. Because every place we have is a creation of both what people are doing and what the rest of nature is trying to do. So, the main topic today is this garden that Toya is going to talk about that's on the Castello Plan from 1660. But what I thought I could do is provide a little bit of context before and after the Dutch. So before. This is a rendering of what Manhattan Island might have looked like when Henry Hudson sailed in 1609. This year, 2024 is the 400-year anniversary of the colonization of New York City in 1624. So that's a really important event, and there's some exhibits at the New York Historical Society, and there'll be lots of events over the course of the year. But, history didn't actually start in 1609. The bedrock, for example, is 540 million years old for the purple bits there. This is a map of our bedrock for Lower Manhattan, and I put in the 1609 shoreline so you can see that. This yellow bit here is representing the ancient edge of North America, or Laurentia as it's called. The oldest plate in the whole world, in all the plate tectonics, is the core of Laurentia. And about 540 million years ago, there was a series of islands offshore, and they slowly moved in and then docked onto the side of North America. And that line is basically where the East River is. And it extends all the way up here into the Bronx. And if any of you came on the train, you came up this line. It's called Cameron's Line in the geological literature. So what that means is that the rocks, the sort of yellow rocks on this map, are about 1.1 billion years old. And the purple rocks, which go underneath Long Island and so forth, about 540 million years old. And here, that boundary is right there. So if you go up if you take the subway and you come down Bedrock Park Boulevard and you see the boulders over there, those are 1.1 billion years old. And then the rocks we have here are only 540 million years old. So this is what we call deep history. This is trying to place history in its much longer history. I'll come a little bit closer in time to about 20,000 years ago when Lower Manhattan looked like this, because it had ice. That was the Wisconsin Glacier. It's called the Wisconsin Glacier. It extended all the way from here to Wisconsin and actually to Washington State and all of Canada. And then around Europe, it was a circumpolar ice sheet. And that ice sheet, it extended, it came from the north as the climate changed, and it got to a point, and that point was right here in New York City. And so the terminal moraine, as it's called, the end moraine, a moraine is the sort of piles of sands and silts that get pushed out the front of the glacier, goes across Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. And that's why we have Prospect Park and Prospect Heights and Crown Heights and Bay Ridge or Jamaica Hills. These are all names that are associated with with the terminal moraine. So lower Manhattan was behind that. And we don't know exactly, but estimates are maybe 1,000 feet of ice. So next time you're in lower Manhattan, you see those big skyscrapers, there was ice that high right where you're standing. The climate changed again, and the ice started to melt, and there were a series of sort of dams that held back the water. And so, interestingly, there was a glacial lake about 18,000 years ago, Glacial Lake Albany, and it was about 6 meters higher than the modern sea level. So Manhattan was actually much smaller then, and it was covered with fresh water. So, and this is a rendering that Jesse Moy did, who's in the audience, and you can sort of see the sort of glacial colors. And then eventually, those waters receded. There's lots of things to say about that. And then those are the waters of 1609. And when the glaciers leave, they leave sands and silts on top of the bedrock, right? So on top of the bedrock surface, there's this superficial geology of glacial till and stratified drift. And then, in the waters, in the Hudson River Fjord and in the East River, you have other combinations of marine substrates. And these are the kinds of things that then the soil would form upon. And so the soil of lower Manhattan is, 16,000 years old, right? It's actually quite young. You get about 1 inch of soil per 100 years in this part of the world. So, and of course, the glaciers and the bedrock shape the topography. And this is our reconstruction of the historical topography and bathymetry. So the blue colors are the depths under the water, and the brown colors are the heights above land. And then, importantly, this intertidal zone, which were salt marshes and beaches in lower Manhattan. And you can, so this is still lower Manhattan. It kind of shapes like lower Manhattan, but it's pretty different, actually, than the lower Manhattan we know today. It was much narrower, and it had this big salt marsh complex in the lower end, which is where Broad Street is, if you're ever downtown. It's Broad Street because when the Dutch came, they thought that's a great place to put canal because it's low and you could bring the ships right in, right? You could bring the barges right in. And then once the English took over, they filled it in, and so it became the Broad Street because it was broader than all the other streets. There were a couple other little streams that came down as well as some springs. So there were people here when Henry Hudson showed up. There have been people in the New York City region for about 8,000 years. So from one perspective, that's a long time. That's 20 times longer than European peoples have been in this part of the world. But of course, in the long history of this landscape, for most of its history, it was just the plants that were here, right? As long as plants were around. And then before that, there was a time where it was just the rocks were around. But the people here, the indigenous people, these are the Lenape people or the Delaware people, as Lucas mentioned. They had a site down in very lower Manhattan, as you expect. There was a series of shell middens along Pearl Street. Pearl Street's thought to have got its name for the oyster shells that were laid along the shore there, along the beach. There were a couple other sites up associated with the Collect Pond, which is that little bit of blue in the middle there, which was a pond that was 80 feet deep, actually in kind of a bedrock hole and then a kettle pond from the glaciers. And you can see a little bit of our reconstruction of the fields, the horticultural fields, which were the original gardens of this part of Manhattan. And so these ecosystems are part of the much larger ecosystems that were here at the beginning of colonization, which were forests and streams and beaches and tidal marshes. And in our mapping of all of New York City, there were about 200 different ecological communities here, which you can sort of think of as neighborhoods. These are sort of nature's neighborhoods, right? Like we know, you can go to the Lower East Side for this, or you can go to the Upper East Side for that, or you can go to Bay Ridge for this sort of thing. And, there's certain people there, there's some kinds of restaurants there, people do some kind of work there, right? So there's, an expectation, and there's interactions between those things that's sort of characteristic of that place. Same with a stream, or a forest, or a beach, or a tidal marsh. And this is a kind of not very good rendering of what it might look like, but we're working to make these kind of better. So, but just to say it was a forested landscape for the most part, except when you had these kind of salt marshes or when you had water bodies. All right, so that's my little tiny taste of before. So let's talk about after. So immediately after, from 1609, when Henry Hudson comes, till 1624, it still looked like this for the most part. Because the Dutch were coming every summer to trade, but not staying. So in 1624, they came to stay. And so for the most part, it looked just like it did before. except that when the Dutch did come to stay, they made some changes. People are often asking me, like, when was the largest ecological change in New York City's history? And I think they're thinking skyscrapers or something, but actually it was the pigs, I think, and the horses and the cows, because one of the things the Dutch did was they brought their native livestock, right, the livestock that they knew in Europe, and then they released them, and so they wandered around. And actually, the pigs were kind of a problem because, they root around, and that what they really like to root around in are the Lenape gardens. And so that caused some conflict, as you might imagine, right? They also brought plants, so introduced plants, some of which were intentional for things they planted in the gardens, and some of the things that were unintentional that just came alongside. There's actually a great history of introduced species, invasive species introduced through the horticultural practice. I think mostly without intention, maybe sometimes with intention. And we have a new scientist joining the garden in the fall, Evelyn Bury, and that's her expertise, is actually invasive species and its relationship to horticulture. So that was a big change. So introduced animals, introduced plants, and then I think the third big change is that immediately changed the way the indigenous people were living here. And this happened in a couple of ways that are not always the story that's told. There's this great book called Changes in the Land, and what he actually argues is that the biggest change was an economic change. And here it's important to understand their culture. So if you grow up in a hunting and gathering kind of culture, there's a lot of conservatism, right? Because you pay a lot. Like if you decide, this year I'm not going to build my wigwam, maybe I just don't feel like it or whatever, and then it's January, then you could die, right? And your family could die. So you don't want to do that. So you want to keep doing what you've done. And what really is valued is your relationships to other people. And particularly, I have to say, to older people like me who actually have seen lots of things about the world, right? Like if there's no Google, if there's no internet to look up what you do in this crisis, what do? You ask somebody who's lived longer than you what their advice would be. So when the Dutch came, especially in the early days, they were here to trade. They wanted furs, and they wanted as many furs as they could get, right? And they brought things that were not known in the Lenape culture, things that were super valuable, like iron pots and steel knives and guns, right? And so what that meant is if you were the person who could bring the most furs, you got those goods, right? And who was that? Well, it was probably not, people like Eric. It was, probably like the young people in the audience who will go out and get lots of beavers, right? Before you had no incentive to kill as many beavers as possible, but now you had every incentive to get as many beavers as possible, because then you become the powerful person because you have these goods. And so within a generation or two, it completely upset the sort of cultural dynamics. And people moved, they moved away, and then sometimes they moved toward the Dutch, depending on the sort of politics of the moment. So these, I think, are the three largest ecological changes, and they all sort of started in 1624. I'm sure Toya will talk to you a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to show you sort of one of these kind of renderings of what early New Amsterdam looked like. And I know most people look at the buildings or the ships, but also look at the topography, right? You can see the sort of hilly island of Manhattan. You can see Diamond Rock out there, which is a little bit exaggerated, but there was a rock just off the tip of lower Manhattan. And the way the changes happened. But, for a long time, what was New Amsterdam was just a little tiny mud town, right, at the tip of an island. It was, I think from the Dutch perspective, it was a very tenuous sort of thing. It's also important in the West India Company, was there was a much larger, East India Company, Dutch East India Company, right? Because Holland at the time had three big colonies, right? They had, Batavia, or what became Indonesia, right? They had a colony in northern part of South America, right? And they had here. And of the three, this was the least important of the three, right? The least productive, if you can imagine. So there's, if you read a lot of the Dutch documents, there's all this back and forth about how can they get more resources? How can they get more attention? Why are you sending us all these people? They eventually started to build out a town. They built the Wall of Wall Street. This is the Castello plan, which Toya will tell you a lot more about. But let me show you some other maps that shows you what came after. So in 1664, the English come, and they sail into New York Harbor, and they have a letter from the king saying it's all of ours. And the Dutch had been taking very good care of their fort, which you see there, which is where the customs house is today, was where the customs house is today. And they basically took over. And there was like a switch back and forth because the the English basically traded back Manhattan so that they could get a little island in Indonesia where you could get nutmeg from. Do you know this book, Nathaniel's Nutmeg? It's really a great story. And then they came back in 1672 and have been here ever since. And the island started to change. So this is the Grimm plan. It was drawn in 1813, but it was drawn of his memories of what it was like in the 1740s in Manhattan. So, and I'll just, you'll see that the shoreline has already started to change. The colonial forces, they so valued the land and having town being compact that they would sell these water lots. So you could actually buy the water on the edge of town, and then you were under contract to fill it in. So you would knock down the closest hill, or you would take garbage from your friends, and you would fill it in, and then you had this valuable thing where you could build a pier. And so that's why we have Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan on the east side, and then we have Water Street, right, which was on the edge of the water. And then we have Front Street, which was fronting the East River, right? And now we have the FDR Highway. You also see the Collect Pond, which was, that was still out of town. That was the fresh water source for this city, this town at the time. Which you can also see in Ratzer's plan of 1767 and the British headquarters map of 1782. This is the map that I use for Mannahatta. So you remember there was a war, the American Revolution. The British lost, I'm sad to say to my British colleagues, sorry. And so the city immediately started growing to the north, and it started filling in the thing. So you can see how the Collect Pond is already sort of surrounded. And this terrible thing happened that they let a leather tannery set up shop, and they polluted the Collect Pond. And so it was the only fresh water source for the city. There were a couple of lousy wells, but that was basically it, and they polluted it. So they built over it, and it disappeared. Now we're in the 19th century. These maps are less interesting to me in this part of the city, but you can see how the city keeps changing, because there was an idea set about what is the land and what is the environment and what is our relationship to plants that continued, into the 1920s and the 50s and today. So Manhattan's about 25% bigger now than it was back then. And, we made this fantastic city, also this frustrating city, this crazy city that we have. So what are we trying to do here at NYBG? We're trying to nature your city. To actually bring a few more plants back into the city for all kinds of good reasons, whether that's in gardens or in parks or in natural areas. Because I think one of the things that's happened over the last 400 years is we realized that these things are not just resources to be used and turned into capital, but they actually provide a sort of natural capital. They have a value in themselves, and they provide ecosystem services to people. And at least here at NYBG, the way we try and get those messages across is by talking about the historical ecology and doing it in this kind of geo-referenced way where we can talk specifically about specific parts of the city. Building tools which help everyone imagine what their neighborhood could look like in the future with an understanding of its past. And increasingly actually trying to build take our horticultural expertise from the garden out into the city and eventually to cities around the world to do active restoration, because who knows more about plants than we do? And we can make the world better through plants, and also by talking to the powers that be about the environmental governance that goes around plants and ecosystems in cities. So I just want to say that I think today's seminar is a really good opportunity to reflect both on where we've come from, where we are today, and where we want to go into the future, and how we all can contribute to that future. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Toya Dubin from the New Amsterdam History Center. I'm the director of the Mapping Early New York project, and I'm going to show you a little bit about our project. So welcome to Peaches, Pears, and Purslane. I want to say thank you to Rhonda Evans and Vanessa Sellers and the team at the Botanical Garden for inviting me here today, and for the use of some beautiful images, which you're going to see later from the Flora Illustrata, to enhance our encyclopedia. I also want to say thank you to Eric Sanderson for allowing us to have the Mannahatta maps, and soon the topography as included in our project. We're very excited about that. I want to say thank you to our sponsors, in particular the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, without whom none of this work would be possible. And I wanted to introduce you very briefly to our creative team, just in case you think it's just me. No way. A project like this takes a lot of people, and this main group is responsible for all kinds of things, including mapping and 3D modeling, and we have an Algonquian historical consultant, so we actually consulted on a great number of things with him. Esme Berg, our executive director, without whom any of it would have happened. And we have a Drupal developer, Mustafa, and a database developer who brings in all of the document collections, along with Cindy, our web designer, who makes it all look beautiful. But we also have additional creative contributors, including Charlie Gearing at the New York State Archives, and Lynn Tantillo, Russell Shorto, Eric Sanderson, and in this case, Joel Grossman, whose work on the archaeology of Lower Manhattan made a really big difference to how we presented the 3D garden. These are links which I can share with you again later. If you need to reach me, info@newamsterdamhistorycenter.org. I will get back to you. Sometimes it takes a day or so, but I will get back to you. Okay. So, with all that said, I'm going to take you to our main project. So this is our website, and I'm going to just do give you a moment of, oops, a moment of site orientation here. You can come into the Mapping Early New York project here or up here, and this is the area where you can see our interactive 3D model that is currently on view at the New York Historical Society. When you come into our project, you'll see that there are buttons here that'll take you back and forth between the 3D map, the encyclopedia, and this time slider map. This map's very fun. You can sort of slide back and forth, and depending on what you're interested in seeing, you can see different maps on the right or the left, and you can zoom in and zoom out as much as you like. And you can, of course, also use any of our very many layers, because you might be interested perhaps in particular tax slots. If you click on them, they will bring up information, and you can usually click right through from here to an entry on a particular item in the encyclopedia. So I'm going to come back here, and I want to give you a note about language. In my work, I spend a lot of time reading 17th century documents. And those documents use words that some people are not comfortable with. So I want to be clear that what we're trying to do here is use as many different terms as possible to allow for good search results that allow for different vocabularies for different users. So please forgive me if I say Indians rather than Native Americans or indigenous people, because sometimes I'm quoting directly from the documents. But we also say words like slaves instead of enslaved persons, and I'm trying very hard to make sure that most of these entries have at least one, if not more than one, vocabulary term to allow for really healthy, nice searching. Our goal was to create an online environment that would allow users to learn about this history and help them to engage, and really fun, to save their work. There is a My Folders area here. Once you've registered, and registration is free and always will be, you can view your folders. And like here's my notes on Chief Oratom. I can add notes to individual items, and I can email this whole folder off to my teacher if I'm a student, to my student if I'm a teacher. It should make it both interesting and fun. So let's go back to the original Castello plan. This map from 1660 is the one that is on display at the New York Historical Society. And I want to quote Nicasius de Sille, who made this map interesting. It would literally just be another really pretty map if it were not for Nicasius. Nicasius took a census in 1660 that told us who was living in every single one of these houses. And that is what has caused 400 years of mad, frenetic scholarship. Because we knew who was there in 1660, we could figure out who might have been there before and after, and we learned all kinds of information about what they did, their business transactions and so forth. It made it very interesting. He was a gardener, a poet, and someone who was completely in love with the landscape that he had landed in. After only being here a year, he said, "The rivers are full of fish, also fruit. The Indians offer these for sale, likewise venison as fat as mutton. The oysters, some so large, one must cut them into 2 or 3 pieces. The weeds consist mostly of strawberries." Yeah, I think he felt he had landed in Eden, right? And that's a very European viewpoint that he's expressing there. So in building the gardens, and you'll see these gardens as we zoom in here, and their shapes and sizes. But specifically, the one that I'm going to take you to up here is the company garden, right, which was used to produce so much food for the settlement. We used a lot of Joel Grossman's work. So, I'm sorry. Joel did some archaeology of Lower Manhattan, and we used his wonderful chart, which you will be seeing over there. All the seeds that he found in the 17th century layer are included in our encyclopedia, and we did not use anything in our 3D model of the garden that he didn't agree was there. In fact, we interviewed him pretty extensively in the building of it. So you'll see that all of our entries that relate to his work include an opportunity for you to download his article, and I think it's a really interesting one. I'm going to show you corn, for example. We have this very beautiful image that the New York Botanical Garden allowed us to include in the encyclopedia, and we also have a very extensive article by Drew Shiptar-Ravis on the Algonquian peoples and their culture and their use and planting of corn. So here's what it looks like. We fly in to this garden, and you'll see as we approach the garden, and I'm going to stop it right there, there's not just a garden gate, there's a garden door, something that'll keep pigs out because they were such a big deal. They were they cleaned the streets. But once you're in the garden, what do gardeners do when they get together today? They share plants, advice about planting, harvesting, soil preparation. They play a game of show and tell that is deeply personal and at the same time part of the basic connection to the earth that makes all of us human. Women in particular, Dutch women, enslaved African women, and indigenous women work together. They bring their children to work with them in the gardens, and they exchange plants and languages and ideas. However, this process in the 17th century was sometimes cordial and sometimes not cordial at all. As the conflicting needs of the indigenous and European communities collided, the need for food, firewood, and resources to support a European urban crowded landscape. This is a very urban landscape for a very wild continent that wasn't prepared to accept that so easily. This caused a crowding out or killing of indigenous agriculture, species, and most sadly, people. It also was built on the labor of enslaved African and enslaved indigenous people living in tiny, crowded spaces. So when you look at a garden like this, you might ask, why did they make these knot gardens and these quartered gardens? Well, you know, an easy answer, of course, is homesickness for an aesthetic. But the more complicated answer is, of course, that gardeners do what gardeners do, right? If you're in the garden and you're working the land in a particular way, you teach that to your children and they do it that way, and so on. And it takes a long time to break habits, gardening habits in particular. Also, the introduction of Native American plants and planting methods occurred, though. So these gardens were made in the shape of the formal knot gardens that everyone was used to from Europe. But what they contained, what they contained was food. And so when we fly in and look at this garden, you'll see that we have planted, despite the very formal arrangement, food. This is squash, pumpkins. Here you have what may be the very first ever 3D modeling of the Three Sisters planting. Apples, pears, peaches. See, the Three Sisters planting is a mound with a fish in the center for fertilizer and squash around the base, corn, and then beans growing up the corn. So this sort of fusion of European and Native American growing patterns and plants is part of what was verified by Joel Grossman's work. We're going to show you another, We also modeled the Dutch West India Company's House of the Enslaved Workers. And we included specifically a garden here also. This very small house had approximately 30 people living in it. And in the back, there was a small garden plot. And we have people working in the garden. And we've planted Dutch white cabbage, red cabbage, and also collards. There are brassica seeds in that 17th century layer. And Joel felt that it was likely that there were quite a number of different brassicas present. So we used AI in the creation of the African enslaved people because in the 17th century, the only 17th century paintings we could find of enslaved Africans were in either fancy dress or mostly not very much at all. And neither one of those seemed terribly appropriate to this climate and to the very hard work that people were going to be doing here. So we did a bunch of research, and I can show you we found swatch books of the kind of cloth that was used and purchased for the enslavement trade. And we used this cloth, fed it into the AI systems, and used that to make clothing for the enslaved workers. So you'll see when we zoom in here one more time, that the gal in the front here is wearing a skirt made of that same cloth that is made of unbleached cotton and indigo dyed cotton woven in India. In fact, it was picked up in India and became part of cargo. All right. So in 1644, we're going to go back to this map. In 1644, a number of enslaved Africans were given their conditional freedom. And you can see here on the time slider, these grants that were given out, we can, depending on the year, make them appear or disappear. So we're going to go to about 1644, and you can see that in this part of Manhattan, Antony Congo, Catalina Antony, Domingo Antony, these are grants to formerly enslaved Africans who were given land and given conditional freedom, and they had to pay a freedom tax, and their freedom tax was based on produce from this land. So they found themselves in a position of having to produce a great deal from these plots. As the years progressed, you can see that that area grew, and so this became known as the land of the blacks. In 1647, we're going to go see Sarah Kierstead's house. Sarah and her husband came from medical families. Her husband was the company doctor. This is their house. This is the little surgery in the back of the house, and this is a medicinal garden. I'm going to find you Sarah's entry. So we have information on Sarah, and I'm going to show you, this is the 3D model of what was going on in front of her house. Sarah's an unusual gal because she spoke Native American languages. And so she was used as an interpreter, and not just by the Dutch West India Company, but also she developed a friendship with a chief named Oratam, who helped negotiate treaties over the course of almost 20 years. And so in front of Sarah's house in 1660, there was this really huge pile of lumber that had been used for building docks, but was sort of excess lumber. And this became a trading area. And we actually have Sarah sitting here with her kids, helping to interpret and helping people to trade with the indigenous people who came bearing venison and corn. And venison, corn, geese, passenger pigeon, all of that stuff was sold, if not on a daily, at least on a weekly basis in this location. So the Dutch West India Company's governors got together, and in 1661, they passed a resolution saying, we want to build an Indian trading house here. And by 1662, they had built it using this lumber. They created a whole Indian trading house here, and this became a trading area fairly permanently. Sarah, like many of our entries, you can see that she was a speaker, an interpreter, an orator, and also an enslaver. We know in her will that she willed enslaved Africans and enslaved indigenous people to her children. So she had a complicated life from our perspective, certainly. Hans Kierstead, her husband, I was fascinated to find this 1850s article on Kierstead's remedy. Given the fact that in her family there were midwives, he was making, or their family was making, an ointment to assist with sores or ulcers or problems in breastfeeding that contained herbs. Very possibly indigenous remedy. Who knows? We don't know. But I found it a very fun and interesting fact. So, going back to the Castello plan, we just left 1647. In 1653, the wall is built. So let's take a look at where the wall is. And I'm going to take these land grants back. And you see the wall is here. And the land of the blacks is very close. That's right up here. So imagine if you had been given a land grant in 1644 and some like 9 years later, suddenly that area that you considered sort of, you know, part of your home decided that they were going to build a wall. And you found yourself crowded out. So this is the wall. You can fly in here and see, and we will be modeling north of the wall in our next iteration. This project is a very iterative thing. It's been through several iterations already. The dimensions of the wall are based on the documents. We actually have diagrams of how deep the ditch was, how high the wall was, all of that stuff, and we used that very closely. There was a decision to build this wall in March. Peter Stuyvesant thought it would take 3 weeks. It took more like 3 months. And the enslaved Africans dug a ditch all the way across the island, across an island that in parts was made of granite. Not a fun job, for sure. It had to have been backbreaking, unimaginably difficult. So in 1655, as we move forward in time, I'm going to turn all this off so that we can zoom in to this garden right here. This house belonged to Hendrik van Dyke. And if I turn on information of interest, you will see that the Peach War actually began in his garden in 1655. And if I click on it, I'll see a whole article on it here, and I can click into our encyclopedia from there. So he walked out the back door of his house and found an indigenous woman picking peaches, and he determined that that was stealing and immediately shot her dead at point blank range. And the Native Americans showed up on September 15th. 64 canoes bearing 500 warriors took over the entire island in under an hour and controlled the whole of this settlement. So the wall really hadn't done them any good, after all. And they negotiated a peace by the end of the day. As they were leaving, someone obviously shot Hendrik van Dyke with an arrow. Other shots ensued, and 3 settlers were killed, 3 indigenous people were killed, and so raids on Pavonia and Staten Island occurred immediately afterwards. And in Staten Island, they pretty much burned those farms to the ground. It was really, they felt they couldn't trust anyone for all kinds of obvious reasons. So crowding out was also biological. As Eric has so well explained to us, it was it occurred because of things like purslane, which grows everywhere now in the Hudson Valley and was a salad herb brought in at the time. Court cases also showed that neighbors crowded one another out, like this document showing a suit between 2 neighbors because someone got mad and let his goats loose on somebody else's land, which will of course mean you'll have nothing. Goats eat everything. They're kind of amazing. We're also very lucky to learn about the oak trees and these beautiful images from the New York Botanicals collections. Acorns were a favorite food of pigs, and oak was a favorite building material, so a different kind of crowding out occurred, right? Once you start removing all of those native species, that means that the indigenous populations didn't necessarily have what they needed for their own culture. This illustration of tulip poplar. Poplar was the main amazing tree that was used for dugout canoes or mashunim. Mashuns are big, long canoes. We think of this little canoe and two guys in a canoe. That's not really what the main traffic on the Hudson was about. Some of these canoes were 30, 40 feet long and could carry 20 people, no problem, along with firewood, huge amounts of beaver fur and so forth. They were the barges of their day. And out on Long Island, they were used for whaling. Someday, I hope we get to see a Mashoon race down the Hudson. That would be so fun. So I'm going to show you Broadway now. And this, of course, is one of the main ways of crowding out. The stockade and the sale of cows and pigs and goats and sheep, which totally changed the landscape. You need huge pastures for this kind of livestock, something that didn't exist in the indigenous landscape prior. And so this addition of all of this livestock that was being bred and sold and used, especially in the area north of the wall, really changed the landscape and crowded out the indigenous site, the indigenous way. So I'm going to go back here to the company garden for you. And I'm going to encourage you to see some evidence of this. Please visit the New York Historical Society's exhibit, New York Before New York. You will see things like a slice of Peter Stuyvesant's pear tree, which, believe it or not, is like a 2-foot diameter. I couldn't believe a pear tree could get that big. And some of the wooden pylons from the original canal, which gives you a sense of how many giant trees had to have been felled in order to build just the one canal. So, in conclusion, the overcrowding of Lower Manhattan caused a crowding out of indigenous culture on that island. And it was built with the labor of enslaved Africans and women who maintained the gardens as men traveled for trading. It forced the free Africans to engage in intensive agriculture to satisfy their annual food taxes and feed their families. It also created gardens that echoed European ideas of order, beauty, and food productivity. These gardens included native species and planting methods that we still emulate today in our own raised bed gardens and formal park gardens. And today, we still trade plants and chat along the fence lines and do our best to make garden more peaceful than it was in the 17th century. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for all of our wonderful presenters, Eric and Toya, for such a wonderful presentation, and for our visitors today. We're going to open it up about 10 minutes for some Q&A, but just a couple quick announcements after the end of the program. Please feel free to come and look at our beautiful 16th and 17th century Dutch books that we have available for you. You'll see some don't touch signs, but we're happy to have some staff members to turn the pages for you. And then we have another selection over here that you can also look at. And at 12:45, if you are interested in taking a nice little walk to the daffodils, my colleague Christine Paulus will be on the steps of the library to guide anyone over there who would be interested. So now I'll let Eric and Toya, if you want to come up and answer a few questions.
Plant archaeologists, you mentioned, that you used to decide what plants to include in the illustrations. Was there any evidence of ornamental plants, or would those not be something that would leave archaeological evidence? They would, of course, leave archaeological evidence. He used seeds, right? So tulip bulbs don't.
No, I don't think those probably would last.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't have lasted if they had been there. So we didn't put in what we couldn't see. And it's Jill Grossman. Yes.
Do you have any evidence of what herbs were grown in Hannah Kirsten's garden?
No, not of hers specifically, but we do have seed evidence of what was grown in lower Manhattan. And in fact, his excavation was below the Van Tienhoven house, which was really
I was
close.
going to say not very far, right?
Yeah, like really like, 2 houses apart or something. So rosemary, parsley, chives, he has a long list of them. Yeah, and they're all included in the encyclopedia. We have entries for every one of them.
So it seems that a lot of things you're mentioning are of European origin, but you also have their corn and squash. And so how quickly did the Dutch started using the native plants? And also, did the natives started adopting some of these European crops that were brought to the Americas? Do you know that when that happened?
From my perspective, having read Joel's work, he's working in centuries, okay? And I'm not sure people really work that way. My feeling about it, and it's just an interpretation, is people do what people do. They exchange plants.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't actually know very much about how much the Native Americans adopted European plants. That's interesting. I don't know very much about it. It's maybe we're saying that corn, beans, and squash, they weren't indigenous to the New York City region. They're all, from Mesoamerican and been traded up and were used by the Lenape, but also many, many cultures all across North America at the time. It was a very successful kind of multi-cropping symbiosis. And I think what was particularly valuable in the kind of temperate zone up here is that those different fruits, that you could dry them and store them over the winter time, right? So you could use them in January or February when you don't really want to go hunting or you don't want to go get oysters out of the water, you could have something to eat.
But a good example of indigenous culture utilizing something brought over from Europe is the peach, right? That was brought over more than 100 years before this colony got started by the Spanish, and it worked its way up the eastern seaboard. And the Iroquois had vast amounts of them. So yes, there was some kind of exchange. I guess it must have been they must have liked some of it, not liked some of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's like us.
Seeds move, right?
Yeah, right.
So 2 days ago we had a Lenape representative who was talking about the 3 species, the squash, the corn, and beans, as a tradition that they have. But you were showing this tradition here as part of the Dutch gardens with the fish. So is that an adoption from Native Americans' traditions, or is that what was the origin of that practice of mixing crops?
Wanting to survive.
But
So even Petrus Stuyvesant in some of his documents talks about planting more mounds of corn. So they had to be doing it. And how did that work? I don't know. Did it work out that the indigenous people taught them how? They went to visit with the indigenous people and saw what they were doing? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But it worked.
Yeah, it was super productive. I mean, even Henry Hudson's journals and Robert Jewett's journals, they talk about Turkish wheat, which was the Dutch interpretation of corn, of maize. I had a student when I was working on Manhattan. It was a Columbia University student, and we actually did some modeling of the Three Sisters system, and it's super productive. That it's almost as productive as modern agriculture, but on a small area, and you can't use tractors and stuff, right? It's like it's very hands-on. And I was really interested in this fertilization because that's the beans are they're nitrogen fixing, right? And so that's the reason you plant them, is they're actually fertilizing the corn and making the corn grow. And then these are climbing beans, so they're climbing on the corn to get up to the sun. And the models that the student and this professor were using suggest that in itself was probably the most important fertilization effect for the growth. And so, super. And Alex McKelvey, who's another scientist here, he studies multi-cropping systems of indigenous peoples all over the world. This is one of those ideas, like somehow we got into, the Western ideas, monoculture agriculture, right? And that has all kinds of problems. And yet you find instances of all kinds of multi-cropping systems all over the world. And particularly in a time of climate change, there's a lot to be said from learning from that experience and from that wisdom.
Please, Vanessa.
I just want to say, as a follow-up, I think you also mentioned that in Adriaan van der Donk's description of the Netherlands, which is 1650 something, he mentioned that the Dutch are not eating their normal porridge anymore,
Right.
which was made of oats,
Right.
but that it was now combined with corn, and it was
Right.
called sapaan.
Yep.
And so I guess they did learn.
Yes.
And I see that you use also, in addition to Grossman's information, also these kind of literature that you find. Can you say a little bit more about
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, sapaan, there's the whole article on sapaan in there, and we include everything. Peter Rose, who's this very famous recreation chef, has written several books on recipes from that time, and we include links to her books and excerpts all over the place. We try very hard to include more ideas rather than fewer ideas, because unless we could actually time travel, none of us will know the answers to all of it. But for sure, oats were grown. They were just so valuable in beer making that you probably weren't going to be eating them for breakfast all the time. And beer, I've often said, no beer, no colony. Pretty simple. Because of what Eric showed us about the holding pond and how it became beginning to be sort of not very potable water very, very, very quickly. And so the good way to survive was to have something you could drink that had been sterilized. And of course, the beer making process involves the boiling of the water and then the addition of a active yeast and then a little bit of alcohol. And now you have something that you can drink and won't make you sick, right? So small beer was something that was brewed in almost every woman's kitchen. And everybody drank it. And it was not beer like you think of today. It was, maybe 1% alcohol. It was very, very low alcohol content.
Coors Light.
Yeah. Or Coors Lighter.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do we have any information on how they were irrigating that garden, like the big garden? How were they watering it?
We don't. I imagine that carrying water has always been in traditional cultures something that you have to do, and it's hard work. And by 1660, that was part of why enslavement was practiced, because the carrying of water, the digging of ditches, the carting of firewood, to support an urban lifestyle in that lower Manhattan required a tremendous amount of very heavy labor.
Yeah, it's maybe worth saying that New York City gets about 4 inches of rain every month, all around the year. So it's actually kind of an aquatic sort of place. And, of course, the precipitation's going up, not down with climate change, which is why it was a forest in the first place, because a temperate forest needs regular water in order to survive. And so I mentioned there were patches in between, where.
Sure.
Yeah.
So they were probably getting plenty of rain in the garden, but if they had a drought and had to start carrying water, one can imagine how much water you'd have to carry to water all those plots, not just that company garden, all those plots.
I've also heard said that the mounds that were made in the Three Sisters garden was also something of a water control strategy, because you built up the mounds and you dug down around them, so that's where the water would sit and then could percolate in.
Was there any sewer system in that moment? Or what would they do with the waste, human waste?
Yes, well, there's a lot of talk about that in the documents, because mostly people used chamber pots, and they tended to do things like dump them in the streets and dump them in the canal and dump them here and there. And so Stuyvesant is regularly trying to get people to stop doing things like that. So they didn't have a sewer system set up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, New York City didn't have a regular sewer system until the 19th century, till the late 19th century.
Oh.
Yeah, there was some internal plumbing for really wealthy houses, but it's actually a sort of recurring chorus in our work that, there was a stream, and, it was an ecological place, and the Native Americans used it, et cetera. And then the Dutch come, and actually the Dutch thought the streams and the salt marshes were more valuable than the land, because you could cut the salt marshes for fodder for the cattle. And being, everybody needs water. So if you were on a stream, and there was lots of land and not so much salt marshes, relatively speaking. And then, that's the kind of ways. And then as the city expanded into the 19th century, particularly in the 19th century, people were dumping their pollution in. And then so you see this sort of moment where suddenly it's not valuable anymore as an economic commodity. It's been used as a waste place. And then people called up to fill it in because it's a health hazard and it's a nuisance and it smells and it's nasty. And then it gets filled in and then the next generation builds over. And that's why we have so many buildings that are on top of old wetlands and salt marshes in New York City. They're now flood prone, right? And it's not because people today built them in those places, but people 100 years ago did. And people just forgot that it was a wetland, for hundreds or thousands of years before that.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Yeah. Do we have any information on the relationship the freed quote-unquote people that had their gardens north and the Native Americans had their relationship between each other?
That big road that comes down through that area and to Broadway was a major trade road, right? It was originally a Lenape trail, and it went all the way up the island. So, and trade was going on all the time. So it's impossible to imagine that the people living in that northern area didn't also trade with the Native Americans. Of course, they must have. They must have. But, once they started really gardening those areas and creating agriculture, there would be no more deer, right? So they would probably buying venison from the indigenous people also. And also think about the idea of eating venison. From the European perspective, that's the ultimate luxury, right? Because in Europe, only the king has access to venison, or the nobility, right? They found themselves here and like, oh my God, venison is being served up every week? This is unbelievable. It would be luxury. So yeah, I'm sure there was that same kind of trade going on there. And those farms up there were also producing things that indigenous people wanted too.
A little later in time, there are a lot of mixed race communities because Native Americans and Black people, were excluded, and so there's lots of stories sort of on the periphery of the city of those people living together, and even a lot of Lenape people today, if you genetically, they share genes that are shared from that time.
Yeah.
At what point did the pollution in the rivers get to be so bad that it ruined oysters as a major food source?
Yeah, it was mostly over-harvesting that took out the oysters in the first instance, and a lot of it happened in the 17th century. And then, there was oyster harvest in New York City until 1871 or 2, and that's when it was banned because people were getting typhoid eating oysters. Yeah. And that, had a lot of economic effects on communities around Jamaica Bay, and also here in the Bronx, like Eastchester Bay, out Dry City Island was, seeded for oysters, and they just shut it all down because people were getting so sick. And it used to be, you read Walt Whitman, oysters were like hot dogs today. They were selling oysters on the half shell on, on the street corner all over the place. That's what you get just for a snack.
Yeah.
Bringing it back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Bronx, it's coming back.
Yeah. Well, the most successful oyster reef restoration in the city is actually the one at the mouth of the Bronx River.
Right.
Because it turns out for oysters, you need they like salt water, but they like a little bit of fresh water too. And so since the Bronx River has been so cleaned up, that means there's good water there.
So they're starting to come back, right?
Yeah. The seeding is doing well. Yeah, I don't think we're harvesting for human consumption yet because the waters aren't clean and swimmable enough.
Sure.
According to the Clean Water Act, although that's eventually the goal.
I think there also with City Island, they do you have to be permitted to do certain things because that's where they're doing most of it now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm an advisor for the City Island Oyster Reef Project, and there are active debates between the DEC about how many oyster claims they can put out. Yeah.
Do the court records survive for the Peach War?
There are court records. Yes, they do. Yes. It is the translations of those records that I used in the research for this. Yes, some of them do, some of them don't. In some of the 19th century translations, they are referencing documents that burned up in that fire in 1911. But some of them,
in the state archives.
yeah, in the state archives, but some of them do survive. So, and those have been translated multiple times. So there's even different interpretations of the same page, which is kind of cool.
Right. I have to say the Dutch were very meticulous about documenting things, particularly land agreements, which ultimately are the claims that underlie all of our property rights in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you so much again to our speakers, the New Amsterdam History Center. Thank you for joining us. Please feel free to take a look at some of our books that we have. And if you are interested in the walk, meet at 12:45 on the steps of the library.